I'm a journalist with CBC Television at the Fifth Estate, and as I'm hearing these stories, I'm just thinking I'm so glad that I have the CBC behind me when I get sued, because they have lots of money and I don't. I was actually reminded as I walk in here today that about 10 years ago I attended the opening to the Nathanson Center for the Study of Organized Crime and Corruption. And I was here with Linda McIntyre, and we sat across from Mr. Nathanson's accountant. And the room was full of judges and lawyers and police officers, and I made the remark that, you know, we could solve the Airbus puzzle here if we got all of our heads together and figured out where all the money went. And the accountant said to me, and Mark Nathanson, who had given a speech, had just finished saying that openness and transparency were important elements in fighting corruption in business. And the accountant said to me, well, that's interesting you would say that. I've got to make sure I don't set up too many offshore accounts. And I wrote a little note to myself, check into Nathanson. And I checked into him. We discovered he had set up a series of secret accounts in the Channel Islands in relation to a gold mine in Mali, Africa, and that his business partner, who was at the center for the fight of crime and corruption that night, was a man who had run one of the biggest Yellow Pages scams in North American history, and this is where a lot of the money had come from. And we did our story 8 months later and got sued, and we're stuck in a lawsuit for a year. And this discussion about, you know, whether you're right or you're wrong, if you're sued, it stays with you and it becomes part of your life. And we won the litigation, but we have the CBC behind us to do that. But I'm here today to talk about the Airbus story and the litigation I went through in that. And so the background of the Airbus story is that in 1994, I was a researcher for the Fifth Estate, and I got a file handed to me by my boss saying, check this out. And it was allegations that $20 million had disappeared into a post office box in Liechtenstein, is what's called grease money, after Air Canada purchased 34 Airbus jets in 1988. And the documentation came from a fellow named Giorgio Plassi, who was Karl-Heinz Schreiber's accountant. Giorgio Plassi had taken money from Schreiber, they got into a fight, and his way to deal with it was to go to the Fifth Estate, so thank you, Giorgio Plassi. And we had these documents that proved without a doubt, there was no doubt, that $20 million disappeared, and that Airbus Industry, a giant multinational corporation in Europe, intended to pay that money to bribe Canadian politicians. There was no doubt about that. This was fact, and the documents proved it. We set about then researching those documents, talking to more people. We talked to over 100 people, and 8 months later we did a story. We called it Sealed in Silence, about the secret deal. We couldn't show where the money went, and we didn't say where it went, but we showed that it disappeared and that it was important that Canadians find out where that money went. We did the story in March of 1995, and nothing happened. There wasn't a peep in Ottawa. Nobody asked questions about it. And here I thought there was going to be a big public inquiry into where did this money go, and nothing happened. But it wasn't until that fall, when we now know about this famous letter of request that got leaked to the Financial Post that alleged that Brian Mulroney had received kickbacks on the sale of those planes and two other deals in Canada. That then led to my litigation problems, which lasted for several years. And Brian Mulroney sued the federal government and the RCMP for $50 million. And I was thankful he didn't sue us. But 3 weeks later, the person who was responsible for setting up the accounts in Liechtenstein, a guy named Karl-Heinz Schreiber, who we now know, sued me for $35 million, and the Fifth Estate. And I couldn't afford the mortgage on my house, so I thought, well, that's okay. We won't have to worry about it too much. And then his partner, Frank Moore, as a lobbyist in Ottawa, sued me for only $15 million. So that was really only $15 million, not the $30 million, $35 million. But I had a total now of $50 million of lawsuits against me. Now, here is the problem. We knew we had a legitimate story that was untold. And a lot of stories are never finished when you go to air or you begin a discussion. In fact, the best way of arriving at the truth is with a free flow of information and a discussion and a proper dialogue. And what those lawsuits did was effectively shut us down for years. And even with the resources of the CBC, any responsible news organization, when it's sued for libel and defamation, it tells the reporters not to talk about the story anymore. And it actually, in the case of the CBC, withholds the documentary for public consumption anymore. Now, this is normally a good idea, and it means that if you did make a mistake, you're not showing malice. But what if the lawsuit is a slap? What if the lawsuit is intended only to make sure the journalists who want to ask tough questions aren't going to ask those tough questions? So we immediately weren't allowed to speak. But the people on the other side of the story who are trying to deny that it happened were allowed to speak. So we had an inherent problem of the powerful interests in Ottawa and political party operatives talking all they wanted about how the story wasn't true. And the journalists who knew what the truth was and who wanted to get at the truth couldn't tell the story. But the other humiliating aspect of getting a lawsuit if you're a journalist is the law actually demands that you produce all of your notes and documents and records to the other side in the lawsuit. So imagine me having to go through all of my notes that I've had with confidential sources, that I've collected from people who've trusted me, and I have to hand this material over to Karl-Heinz Schreiber. I mean, imagine the law. The law is such in Canada that the worst fraud artist in this country can launch a lawsuit against anybody and get a journalist and get their documents. So we managed to get involved in a process where I would delete the names of my sources, and I went through a big stack of documents, spending 3 months deleting names or blocking out names for the time being. So eventually so then fast forward to 5 more months, I get frustrated with the fact we can't speak. I write an article for the Canadian Association of Journalists Media Magazine to at least explain the spin campaign that was in place, the slap campaign that was in place to prevent us from telling the story. The CBC heard I was writing the story, canceled the story, and said we weren't going to tell that story. I'm not criticizing the CBC for doing that. I understand their perspective. We had a lawsuit of $50 million against us, but it meant the journalists who wanted to tell the truth couldn't tell the truth. So this continued for several years until we asked Karl-Heinz Schreiber himself to attend to be examined on his affidavit of documents. And we said, okay, if we have to produce our documents, then you have to produce yours. Well, Karl-Heinz Schreiber did not want to produce his bank records and all that kind of thing, so the lawsuit just hung out there as, for years and years, the public thinking that the CBC was still being sued, and we didn't want to pursue it anymore for fear of waking him up. So for several years, nothing happened, and it was actually 5 years later that we finally did another Airbus story. And I think it might have been the first time that CBC produced another story while being sued for $50 million about the very same story. And what happened there was we had, through a secret source in Europe, obtained Karl-Heinz Schreiber's secret bank documents. And we discovered a coded account called Britain. You've probably heard of this now, B-R-I-T-A-N. And when I looked at the account, I thought to myself, well, if you take out the T, you've got Brian. And we called, long story short, we called Brian Mulrooney, got a call back from his public relations spokesperson who denied it all. But Brian Mulrooney then sent a letter to every member of the CBC Board of Directors before our story, saying if the story went to air and it mentioned that he got the money, he'd sue every member of the Board of Directors. But to CBC's credit, it was now 5 years into the process, and I'd been through 5 years of a lawsuit. We went ahead and published the story, and promptly got sued again for $2 million. So this is the kind of thing we're up against, and I really believe that it's because of these lawsuits that were put in place that we didn't get a proper discussion about the issue when we should have. We're having a public inquiry 15 years later, and it took all these years for the truth to emerge. And I would say the central problem and why we're having the inquiry today about Karl-Heinz Schreiber and Brian Mulrooney is because of these lawsuits that were put in place. And I would argue that if we had proper slap legislation in Ontario, they couldn't do these kinds of things. Thank you.